Welcome to Workplace Wake Up, your go-to podcast for practical employment law guidance. I'm Jennifer Shaw, the founder of Shaw Law Group, and I'm here to help HR professionals and leaders navigate the legal minefield of the modern workplace. Each week, we tackle real-world issues with clear advice and a little tough love. Let's get started. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us here today. I am honored to have as a guest this morning, Katherine Guilford, one of the attorneys on our team. Katherine, good morning.
Good morning, Jen. Thank you for having me today. I'm so excited to be here.
Well, I'm so happy to have you. And as many of you probably know, Katherine is a very well-respected investigator. She does all kinds of internal investigations, climate assessments, etc., for both public and private sector clients. And one of her areas of expertise is Title IX. And we've all been reading a lot about Title IX investigations recently. So I thought it would be really good to have Katherine on to talk to us a little bit about Title IX generally, but specifically about interviewing children. Now, you may be thinking as you're driving or working out or whatever you're doing this morning while you're listening to the podcast, what the heck? Are children interviewed in workplace investigations? Well, Katherine, let's tell everybody, what are Title IX investigations and how do they come up, first of all?
Yeah, absolutely. So Title IX is a federal law that requires that if you are a school district or an education program that receives federal funding, they are required to prevent and address any sex-based discrimination, which also includes sexual harassment. And if something does fall within that definition of sexual harassment, there's these very strict procedural requirements of how schools are required to address and prevent that sexual harassment. And Title IX doesn't just apply to colleges. I know that we think of it that way most of the time, but it also applies to K-12 school districts that receive federal funding. So if there's concerns about sexual harassment all the way from kindergarten to 12th grade, the schools need to go through that Title IX process, which does include an investigation, which is how we get to this point of where it's necessary for us to sit down and interview kids.
Katherine, that's super helpful. Okay, just to be clear for everybody on the podcast, it's not just schools, right? It's recipients of federal funds. So could that also be, for example, like a museum that's getting federal funding? I mean, normally we think of Title IX in the context of schools, but a Title IX investigation can be required with an entity that is receiving federal funding if there's sex-based discrimination. Is that correct?
That's right, as long as they are an educational program or activity and they receive that federal funding.
So a museum that has like after-school programs or programs for children or educational programs, even for adults, I guess, if they're using federal funding for that, they'd be subject to Title IX. Okay, now there's been some controversy about Title IX recently in terms of what regulations apply, et cetera. Can you just give us like a short little snippet about what's the universe we're in these days in terms of which regulations apply and what folks need to be thinking about for Title IX investigations?
Sure. So let's talk specifically about the grievance process for sexual harassment. And what triggers Title IX is a very specific set of circumstances where, one, the complainant needs to be either participating or attempting to participate in the educational program or activity. And then the school also has to have substantial control over the respondent and the context in which the harassment occurred. Then there's also what they refer to as subject matter jurisdiction, where it's only a specific definition of sexual harassment that falls under Title IX. And the first of those categories is quid pro quo harassment, where you have one of your employees who's conditioning the benefits of the education program. So if they condition the benefits of the education program on someone agreeing to unwanted sexual activity or take away a certain benefit because someone did not agree to sexual activity, any type of those quid pro quo allegations, those fall under Title IX. Title IX also covers sexual assault, domestic violence, and stalking, and any sex-based conduct that's so severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive that it limits the complainant's access to education. So just to be clear that all of these types of issues are within the Title IX bucket.
Got it. Okay. So obviously we could have like an all-day training as you provide on Title IX, but the basic premise here is that what we generally are doing is working with schools, K through 12 schools, universities. And one of the challenges that you've come up with recently are interviewing kids. So let's talk a little bit about that. The reason I think this is interesting for all of you on the podcast is I want you to understand that there are areas of employment law, areas of investigations, advice and counsel training, et cetera, that are not as well known, but are really important. And so we get a ton of calls when it comes to folks needing these types of investigations. And there is a very limited number of investigators who are trained to actually do these investigations. So, Katherine, talk to us a little bit about interviewing children and what kinds of issues come up.
Absolutely. So I'm going to talk to you and tell you about what I know about interviewing children. And I want to call out that I have my information on best practices for interviewing children from APSAC, the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children. They are very focused in on helping folks who are in law enforcement, helping folks who are on child protective services teams be able to interview children in a manner that's backed by the science of it gets you the most reliable results.
Great. So anybody who's doing a Title IX investigation with kids really should be looking at that resource.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So when we think about investigative interviews with adults, one of the first we think of is our admonitions, where we explain what our role is and talk through the process, ask for confidentiality, all of those good things. For kids, it's important to set the stage a little bit differently, where you not only tell them about your role, but you also do a little bit of practice for narrative events. So for younger kids, explaining your role might even be as simple and limited as, "Hi, my name is Katherine. I'm here to ask you questions and listen to what you have to say today." It really depends on the age of the child and their developmental ability. Now, when we set aside that time for those admonitions, there are a few important ones that you don't want to skip over. And the first one of those is you want to give them instructions not to guess when you ask them questions. So what you'll say is, for our conversation today, I want to tell you that if you don't understand what I've asked you, don't guess. And let's do a little bit of practice here today. So, Jen, what did I have for breakfast today?
Oh, gosh. What would you normally have? Oh, I'm not supposed to guess. Okay. I don't know.
You did that exactly right. You didn't know, and then you didn't guess. So you follow up with that little bit of encouragement of you did the right thing. And that's what we want to do in our conversation today.
That makes sense because we have to. One of the things that you and I have talked about a lot in the context of any investigation is making the individuals who we're talking to comfortable, right? And certainly that can be much more of a challenge with kids.
Definitely. Now, the next one is, if you don't understand what I'm talking about, tell me that you don't understand. So let's try a little bit of practice here.
Okay.
So, Jen, how many times did the blueberries jump up today?
How many times did the blueberries jump up? Sorry, I'm not tracking.
That's exactly right. You didn't understand what I was talking about, and you told me. That's exactly what I want you to do.
Perfect. By the way, we did not practice these, everybody, so I don't really know what happened with the blueberries. Okay, awesome.
Putting Jen on the spot here.
No, I love it.
All right. The third one we want to go over is correct me if I say anything that's wrong. Now, for an adult, you can just write out and say that. Correct me if I say anything inaccurate. But you do want to take that time to do that practice with the child and say, we'll do one more. Jen, how did you enjoy your 90th birthday party last week?
Oh, gosh, I didn't have a 90th birthday party last week, Katherine. I think you may have me confused with someone else. I may feel 90, but I have not had a 90th birthday party.
That's absolutely right. I said something wrong and you corrected me. Now, when we talk about adult interviews, we talk about the expectation that somebody tell the truth during an interview, but that can be difficult for younger children to understand. Now, in the context of having a child testify at court, in some jurisdictions, the court will require that the child can pass a truth-lie competency test where they're able to demonstrate that they know the difference between a truth and a lie, and then therefore that they can swear to tell the truth. The interesting part is that the studies have shown that going through that truth-lie competency test doesn't actually increase the reliability of the child's statements. What does increase the reliability of the child's statements is to ask them to promise to tell the truth. So you'll ask them, do you promise that you'll tell the truth? And even for students who are young enough who can't reliably tell you the difference between what truth is and what a lie is, just asking them to promise to tell the truth increases the reliability and the accuracy of what they tell you.
That makes a lot of sense. And obviously, the goal of any investigation is getting to the truth, right? Is trying to figure out what happened. And because as investigators, we're not present for the incident that is the subject of the investigation, all we can do is try to figure out what's more likely than not to have occurred, right? That's that preponderance of the evidence standard. And certainly with the child, I'm sure there's even more of a desire than adults have to please the investigator, right? So we want to make sure that they know, hey, we just want you to tell the truth. That's the most important thing here.
Absolutely. And you brought up a good point that it's very important to de-emphasize authority throughout the process, because the more of an authoritative lawyer in a suit you look like, the more that they're going to want to please you and tell you whatever they think that you want to hear. So typically for these interviews, I would, dress down, sit on their level, talk to them as if we were equals, and let them know that I want to hear from you. I'm not here to tell you what to do.
That's super helpful too. And I guess that applies to adults also, right? We want everybody to be comfortable.
Now, another thing that is going to take a little bit of extra time, but is very important, and you don't want to skip it, is what is called a narrative practice at the beginning of the interview, where you'll pick a neutral event and have the child explain it to you in a narrative way. So you'll say something like, tell me all about your last birthday, and have them, tell you what happened, and then you can follow up with open-ended prompts like, tell me everything that happened about what you said here, what happened next, and just do that practice of, we're talking about something that's in the past and you're telling me what happened, and I'm going to follow up with some questions.
So, Katherine, this is really helpful because I'm getting the sense, and I hope everybody else is too, that you can't rush these kinds of interviews. Not that you would ever rush them when you're doing an investigation, but certainly when you're dealing with someone who's younger and a child, even a teenager, I can imagine, or someone in college, you have to take the time to prepare not only substantively, but also for how you're going to develop that rapport with the witness. And you've got a lot to do, it sounds like, when they're little.
Yeah, you have to take those extra steps and not skip what it feels like as an adult that these are silly little things, but they really make a big difference when you're talking with a younger person. Now, I want to pause here and talk a little bit about involving the parent in the interview. Now, this is where I deviate a little bit away from APSAC, where APSAC says the best practice is it's just you as the interview alone in the room with the child. The parents aren't present. I imagine that's recommended in that police context, in that Child Protective Services context, where the interviewer has a little more control about how the parent behaves. But in Title IX, it's very clear that parents have the right throughout the process to act on behalf of their student, and the student has the right to have an advisor present during the investigation. Not only that, but this is the most important piece for me as the investigator. The Title IX regulations absolutely prohibits schools from requiring anybody to participate in the Title IX investigation process. So if you don't have that rapport with the parent and include them in the process, they could very easily say, we're not going to do this. We don't like this investigator. I'm not going to have my child sit down with her. I do like to have the parents involved and have them on the same team with me. So sometimes what I'll do is I'll sit down with the parents maybe 30 minutes before the interview with the child and just talk through them what they can expect from the interview and how I'm going to tap on their shoulder to help me during the process. So I'll usually tell them about this narrative event practice and say, I want to talk about something neutral and something fun at the beginning of the interview. If I just make something up, like, for example, I say, tell me everything that happened about breakfast this morning. For all I know, their parents could have been having a big fight that morning, and it's a very emotionally charged and difficult conversation, when that's not really what I want to be doing during that portion of the interview. So I'll ask the parents to give me suggestions of what are some things that we can talk about at the beginning of the interview.
Okay, that's super helpful too. And Katherine, we try to keep these podcasts, to 15 minutes or so. We're kind of getting near the end, but what are a couple of tips that you really want people to take away other than what we've already talked about, which is great information? Anything else that you want to make sure that people think about if they're in a position, we have thousands of people who listen to this podcast, and many of them do internal investigations. They may be doing interviews with kids. What are a couple things that you really want them to remember that we haven't discussed?
I think the most important that for me as an investigator to remember is you can have all of this education, all of the training in the world, but if you don't sit down to that interview fully present, fully observing the child and trying to understand where they're coming from, you're not going to have a very successful interview. So I do encourage everybody to dial in, make sure they do their research and they do their prep, but don't forget to stay present and engaged when you actually sit down for the interview.
So it sounds like, Katherine, you got to be kind of a special person to be able to do these interviews, right? You have to actually be willing to take the time. And we all know that's tough, right? Our calendars are busy. We've got a lot of things going on. But if you're doing an investigation, any Title IX investigation, just like any regular workplace investigation, you've got to be willing to invest the time and energy to do it correctly. Katherine, it is such a pleasure to have you here. You have so much information. I could talk to you about this forever. I believe that you and I have talked about doing a webinar on this topic, and I really think we should. I think there's so much information to share out there about this, and I think that would be great. So you and I should work on that for sure.
Absolutely. I'd love to.
Well, Katherine, thank you for joining me. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us today. Katherine, it's always a pleasure. The rest of you, go have an awesome day, and we'll see you next time. Thanks so much. Workplace Wake Up, including our guests and hosts, do not provide legal advice in this podcast. Do not act upon any of the information discussed in this podcast without first consulting a licensed attorney in your jurisdiction. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Workplace Wake Up. If you found today's discussion helpful, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share the podcast with your HR and leadership teams. For more insights, training programs, and legal updates, you can visit us at shawlawgroup.com.